The Land of Knots by Sigizmund Krzhizhanovsky. Those come to serve the great sovereign count as Ises, others marked down as knots. From a census, late 17th century. 1. I am, ad sum. And I namely am, because I belong to the great nation of Ises. I cannot not be. I think that's fairly clear and common sense. But to explain to you, my worthy Ises, how being can tolerate a clot of knots, how it can have allowed, even on a desolate outskirt in an out-of-the-way little planet, a strange little world of knots to spring up and spread. That, for me, will be extremely difficult. Nevertheless, the land of knots is a fact. I myself have been there, and what follows will attest to the truth of my declaration. A philosophizing knot once said, "Being cannot not be without becoming nothing, while nothing cannot be without becoming being." This is so very reasonable, it's hard to believe that a knot, a non-existent being, could, in little more than a dozen words, have come so close to the truth. But to return, the bizarre land of knots which I chanced to visit is a sphere that to them, the knots, seems flat. Over this seeming flatness, through equal intervals of time, which, as the wisest knots have proven, does not exist per se, occur the seeming risings and settings of a sun that is in fact motionless relative to their little world, that begets shadows now short, now long, now flaring, now fading, so that one cannot say with any certainty whether or not those shadows exist. True, the knots teach their knotkins that shadows are cast by things, but if one thinks about this sensibly, then one cannot know exactly if shadows are cast by things or things by shadows, and if one oughtn't to cast aside, as pure ostensibilities, not things, not shadows, and the knots themselves with their notional notions. 2. Knots live cheek by jowl. To them it has always seemed, and seems, that many no's can always make a yes, that a host of ghosts can be condensed into a solid body. This, of course, is a hopeless notion, even a bit silly, and experiments with such a notion are bound to fail. Then again, these stubborn and extended attempts to be subverted by being and launched anew are the stuff of their so-called life. Hence, their love, their society, their religion. Love is when one knot is drawn to another knot, unaware that that knot does not exist. This passionate unawareness may last, depending on the circumstances, moments, minutes, months, or even longer. By the way, they usually love each other in the dark, and only in those rare moments are those imaginary beings from the land of knots possibly sincere, admitting as they do that they are no more visible in the light than in the dark. In spring, when in their little world the faded grasses and not intoxicating knot flowers bloom, when here too, in our great nation of Ises, reality becomes a dream, and dreams wake as reality, those imaginary beings start imagining that they too can have love. Just as the wind entwines one grass with another, so the spring effusion, confusing one eye with another, impels even knots to exchange what they do not have, bodies and souls. And only when the swirl has fanned away, when the spring has shed its petals, do the knots see it was all nothing. 3. Knot scholars, shut up in their studies, spend endless years trying to prove to themselves and others, with the help of letters, that they exist. This is a favorite theme in their tracts and dissertations. The letters comply, but the truth always tells the knot no. You would think that rather than try to prove oneself to oneself, rather than weave ideas about life, it would be far simpler to live, having finished part 1 of the ethics, rather than embark on part 2. It would be simpler and more useful to perform at least one ethical act. But no, surrounded by his bookish rustlings, his bookshelves buckling beneath their heaps of letters, the knot tries to prove himself to himself. Time, tugging at the pointed hands on their clock faces, goes round and round, and no matter how pointed some knot thoughts are, they know only how to revolve around themselves. At any rate, the succession of events in the head of a knot is as follows. First the soul, then a piece of dead flesh, then decaying detritus, and then, if one peers through the skull's blind black sockets, the most ordinary nothing, the knot reduced to naught. One knot adept began thus: I think, therefore I am. But existence is not a consequence of thought. Thought is a consequence of existence, and since even knot logic strictly forbids arguments in which a premise follows from a conclusion, the knots, by inferring their existence from their thinking, forbid themselves to themselves with all the premises of their logics. And yet, do many knots think? Occasional thinkers, a handful of ideationists, and that's all. I don't recall any others. So the rest of them not only don't exist, they don't even think. Scholarly knots, immured in their studies and the pages of their books, typically divide their all into I and not I. Therefore, given not A and not B in their respective studies, A is not I to B, and B is not I to A. In other words, both A and B will always be not I to someone. That constant someone, even their sages did not suspect, was I, an eyes, journeying through their land. It must be admitted, certain philosophizing knots have, by dint of conjecture, arrived at a notifying philosophy. In their inventions, dim as the glimmers of their winter dawns, I at times divined an eternal, all-encompassing truth. Some truly intrepid knots have resolved to do the extraordinary, to diffuse themselves by dint of their thoughts. Thus, one wise knot withdrew from the world of ostensibilities to a small, quiet study where he spent long years in solitary reflection without ever opening his window on the outside world. He became estranged from that world from which he had cut himself off with his sensorium and thinking. Then one day, wandering up to the window by chance, he remembered that world outside and pulled the cord of the blind. Imagine the knot's surprise when, out the window, he saw no world at all, as if the whole world, lambent with stars and suns, clad in green and azure, had fallen away, had come unstuck from the panes like a cheap paste-on picture washed off by the rain. Still clutching the cord, the scholar stared into the yawning blackness. There was absolutely no doubt. This was nothing. The most ordinary nothing. The scholar let go of the cord. The blind rustled down. Then he went to his writing table and set to work on what would become his famous treatise, arguing that the outside world is just a bad habit of the so-called nervous system. True, naysayers maintained that the fact substantiating this treatise was easily explained. The window shutters were closed, a circumstance that the absent-minded philosopher had forgotten when he raised the blind. He mistook wooden shutters painted black for the outside world, and jumped to conclusions. It happens. Another wise knot, eyeing the hands of his pocket watch, made the profound observation that although they moved continually, they never left his pocket. Everything else in his system was a simple analogy. But these are isolated cases. As a rule, as I've said, the knots who came into being owing to some incomprehensible oversight or error, must naturally fear and do fear the truth, since the truth is something that, in its very essence, annuls all knots. Though they flatter this world in their books, it is not to the knots' advantage to search for the truth, and they find salvation in mystery. Their religion, for instance, is a complex maze of mysteries and what they call sacraments, in which they hide something from themselves, deftly practicing the remarkable art of not knowing, attaining at times an astonishing mastery. The Knots' holy books say that their world was made from nothing. This is true. To study their world is to encounter at every turn that strange material from which it was created. Nothing. The few glimmers of truth I found in their books were gradually obscured by their words and sophistries. In their book of Genesis, for instance, it says that the Knots' forebears ate of the tree of knowledge, but not of the tree of life. Here I must acquaint you, my worthy Ises, with an alien concept specific to Knots: death. Although Knots do contrive at times with extreme naturalness to feign existence, this hoax is exposed sooner or later by what they call death. The knot, who supposedly existed only a moment ago, suddenly weakens, becomes still, stops feigning life, and ceases to be. The truth bursts forth. Over the so-called grave of the knot, now exposed by death, as yet unexposed knots sing something about eternal memory, speak about the soul's immortality, and so on, but neither the speakers nor the listeners believe this. Eternal memory is usually forgotten in a few revolutions of the hour hand. Some knots, the most ambitious ones, cling to their immortal name, but a name is just a handful of letters and scarcely worth discussing. In any case, the knots do not like death. It troubles their conscience, spoils their game of appearances, and torments them with grim forebodings. Their marvelous art of appearing, their ability to be everything while being nothing, was nowhere so striking as in that specifically knot institution, the theater. We Ises invariably reside in our own ownness, whereas knots will, in a twinkling, trick themselves out in other people's lives, in their theaters, on a counterfeit ground made of boards, under artificial lights instead of the sun, surrounded by counterfeit painted things. Knots live invented lives, cry over non-existent sorrows, laugh for make-believe joy. As I watched, I couldn't but agree with their best critics who maintain that for them, the knots, theater is a school of life. Four. Here is a fragment from Knot mythology. In the beginning was chaos. Chaos spewed forth ocean. Ocean took to wife fate. And to fate and ocean were born 3 sons, En, Kai, and Pan. The eldest, Pan, inordinately tall, strong, and fond of power, had the temperament of his mother. Fate, the middle son, En, who loved solitude, was fitful and morose like his grandfather Chaos. The youngest, Kai, was neither this nor that. He copied his brothers, both the gregarious Pan and the taciturn En. The brothers vied with each other for Kai's attention. Each loved and taught him in his own way. When Kai was still very small, Pan would scoop up a pearl in his enormous fingers, or a trembling drop of deathly afraid water, and show Kai his reflection inside the pearl or drop. Kai would always laugh. When Kai was a bit older, Pan taught him to play hide and seek. The huge yet nimble Pan would hide inside the curl of a crashing wave, or between the valves of a tiny mollusk, or among the petals of flowers on dancing stems, or even between barely visible ripples on the water, Kai would look for him, splashing the waves with his little fists, riffling the flowers with his plump fingers, prying apart the valves of mollusks. And what joy was his when suddenly, among the tiny petals or sparkling ripples, he discovered his brother. "Found you!" Kai would cry, and the enormous Pan, straightening up to his full gigantic height, would roar with thunderous laughter. N looked on in silence at the giant's games with the little boy. Seizing the moment when Kai was alone, he would take him to his cave for lessons in solitude and pride. Reaching for his own suddenly dilated pupil with fine tenacious fingers, N would pluck out of his eye a world entire, with stars and blue skies, seas and lands, and, smiling slyly, show this new bauble to the wonder-struck child. But on hearing Pan's heavy footfall or his father's churning tread, N would quickly slip the world back into his eye, lower his eyelids, and quietly retreat into the depths of his lonely cave. Kai became so enamored of this game that whenever he caught sight of N, his little fists would fly up, reaching for his brother's eyes. One day, Pan heard Kai crying. He rushed up. The little boy was desperately trying to pull out of his eye something enormous, mottled and manifold, brilliant with the radiance of all the suns. This something was stuck in his pupil, and no matter how he struggled, it would not budge. Pan quickly shoved the enormous, manifold brilliance back inside the child's eye and slapped his trembling fingers. "Don't you ever do that again!" he shouted. "Do you hear me?" Scared to death, Kai was silent. When Ocean grew old and streaked with foamy gray, he began to feel the weight of his shorelessness. Fate said to him, "Ocean, why should you not acquire shores for a good price?" The old man was loath, but Fate kept insisting, you should, until Ocean summoned his sons before him and said, "En, Kai, Pan, my shorelessness weighs on me. I gave you life, and I shall give you death if you do not do exactly as I say. Go into my shorelessness, and fetch me, grudging neither your life nor the price, shores." Little Kai took his brothers by the hand, and they set off into that shorelessness for hours, Pan, Kai, and En. On and on they walked. One day, overcome by sleep, they lay down to rest, and Pan and En dreamed the same dream. Nothing appeared to them, unseeing and unseen, and said in a hollow, sepulchral voice, "I am nothing. I do not appear in reality, only in dreams. I have shores, but I am hungry, and shall give them only to the ones who say, 'Yes, I will not be. I won't take fewer than 2. The night passed. En recounted his dream to Pan, and Pan his to En, and the brothers said to each other, "Whatever our father Ocean has got into his head, it cannot be got out. If we 3 return without shores, he will kill all 3 of us. Better that 2 of us should die. We are sorry to part with sweet life, sorrier still to part from our dear little brother Kai, but if our mother Fate so wills it, then yes, we will not be." With that, they fell back to sleep, but their sleep was eternal. Little Kai poked and prodded the still bodies of his sleeping brothers. Finally, looking about for help, he saw lying in front of him brand-new, never-worn shoes, steeper here, flatter there, sloping elsewhere. Kai called out, "En! Pan!" Seated on the shore's cliffs and ledges, Echo mimicked him. "En! Pan!" Kai began to cry. Then, drying his tears, he hoisted the craggy shores onto his tender shoulders and, staggering under the weight, carried his costly purchase back to his father. Old Ocean rejoiced at the shores. He flowed into them, tenderly lapping. He grew calm and fell asleep. Kai was left in the care of his mother, Fate. Without his brothers, Kai began to feel melancholy. "Dear Anne, dear Pan, what am I without you?" he wailed. "When the two of you, big and strong, took me by the hand, you, Anne, by the right, and you, Pan, by the left, then I was strong with your strength and great with your greatness. Never again will you play hide and seek with me, Pan, darting under ripples and petals. Never again will you show me the world inside your eye, dear Anne. Without the two of you, I am only Kai, only silly little Kai, an and, adjoining nothing." Little Kai began to waste and wilt. He shrank from Kai to Kai. Here the myth breaks off. Only in not books of so-called logic did I find the ending, though it is overly terse and dry. All men are mortal. Kai is a man, therefore Kai is mortal. Evidently, if one believes these books, Kai became mortal. From him came the Knots, or mortals as they are called in myth, beings whose essence lies in their ability to die, that is, not to be. From their distant ancestor they inherited, all their books make this clear, his longing for Pan-en. Settled along the shorelessness of shore-embraced ocean, they still repeat the old legend about Kai, although distortions have crept in over time. Kai's longing for his dead brothers has turned into their longing for themselves. Kai's name is now pronounced Cain, and the story of the disappearance of his beloved brothers has been twisted into that of Cain's fratricide. Five. The most anti-existential aspect of the Knots is their reason, that builder of multiple multiplicities, thus, therefore, and so on. In the land of Knots, even a pitiful cactus grows from root to spine, yet a Knots thought, tucked inside 8 interlocking bones that form the head, tends from spine to root, flows from effect to cause, contrary to all of nature, which flows from cause to effect, which spurs growth from roots to leaves. Upon receiving a stimulus, a shot, as it were, from without, the Knots reason turns all perceptions upside down, thinks against the current of time, turning to before only after, moving from effect to cause. Just as their reason revolts against the movement of the hour hand that points to 3 after 2 and 2 after 1, so it revolts against all of nature, whirling planets through orbits, blood through veins, and water through plant cells, while brooking no opposition. The Knots invented the legend of the ship Argo, but isn't their imaginary life a tale of the wreck of Ergo? Parenthetically, I would note that the profound system of panlogism recognized by very learned Knots boils down to the story of one extremely anxious Ergo that meddled in every problem until it lost one of its letters. Whoever finds the R and the ego is requested to return them to their proper place. Shortly before leaving the land of the imaginary, I witnessed a scene that made me extremely angry. One day I saw a knot of little Knotkins gathered round a grown-up Knot, and, intrigued, I approached the group. The Knot was telling the Knotkins about, only guess what, my worthy Ises, about our life, about life in the nation of Ises. The Knot's story was confused and nonsensical, but even so it profoundly disturbed and even stunned me. I strode right up to him, barging past the frightened little Knotkins. "Now where could you have learned that?" I exclaimed. "Nowhere," the Knot drawled with a faint smile. "It's just a fairy tale, a story about what never was." "If you want to tell tall tales," I barked, "you'd better tell them about your own lives, honestly and without involving being." I turned round and walked off. Behind me I could hear the little Knotkins' high-pitched giggles. After that seemingly trivial incident, a strange nagging melancholy came over me, my dear fellow Ises. Nevertheless, I firmly resolved to continue my journey. I did not remain long in the Knot's little world. Pushing on farther and farther, deeper and deeper into the wastes of nothing, I left the Knot land, where shadows are cast by things, and reached a world where rather than shadows by things, things are cast by shadows, where the sun barely rises above the arc of the horizon, fumbling the quavery contours of things with its weak and tremulous rays. I now entered the dead land, where there are neither suns nor things, only an eternal whirling and silent creeping of shadows. Here, the sadness that had come over me while still in the land of knots became unbearable. I pictured my distant, dazzling homeland, and you, my real and undoubted Isis, far away, beyond the wastes of the worlds, and I turned back. Again, I crossed the worlds, the world of shadows, timidly trembling at the feet of things. Here, I bid my knot acquaintances a final farewell, and at last I reached the land where things have no shadows, where everything is flooded with a light, forever at its zenith. Nearly there, I thought, as I continued my rapid return to the sun, the last leg of the journey. Under the lashes of waning and waxing beams, shadowless things faded, lost their contours, and quivered, until they too had diffused. Like their shadows, I had returned home to you, my fellow Isis.